Welcome everyone to our Roots and Belonging Asian Pacific Islanders Heritage Month special presentation. And I'm Lynn Crowley with the Asian Pacific Islanders Coalition South Puget Sound chapters. I'm one of the co-chair, and we have our other co-chair, Brian, with us here. If you want to just kind of wait for a second, that would be great. We are very, very happy to be able to have three of our distinguished speakers to join us today to talk about our past history, what we are doing currently, and what we can look forward to for the future. So the three speakers we have is Tracy Lai, Erica Chung, and Nguyen. Because of the history aspect of our presentation, we are going to ask Tracy to do the start. So Tracy, let me just go ahead and give you a little bit introduction to Tracy, who is a teacher from Seattle Central College. She teaches history, ethnic and women's studies, and she is a member of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. She was the chair before until just recently. She has published a book, and she is also working on another book currently with Ken Wang on a history of Apala. And it will be expected to be released in August 2021. So we are really happy to have her start to share a little bit about API's histories to the Washington State. Please, Tracy.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I'm going to share my screen. And let's see. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity for the three of us to talk about our histories and to reflect on the meaning of this month. Lynn originally asked us if we might talk a little bit about our family, so I'm sharing a few family photos. On the left is they're my grandparents on my father's side, Dang Xi and Lai Bing, and it's a photo of when they were quite the young couple, 1923. On the right, you see their family by 1937, and it's my father in the upper right corner, not looking very happy, I think, posing for this picture. I like to start there because their immigration experience was part of the exclusion era, which refers to when the Chinese Exclusion Act, first passed in 1882, was in force. And they, like over 100,000 other Chinese, as well as other immigrants, were detained at Angel Island Immigration Detention Center located in San Francisco Bay. This center has particular significance because later, when the National Park Service was kind of evaluating the buildings and what to do with them, it was discovered that the barrack walls had over 135 poems carved into the walls in Chinese characters. This is just one of them. And you know, I tried to do a side-by-side, so, you know, those of you who can read the characters can also contemplate the translation. My uncle, Mark Lai, along with Judy Young and Jenny Lim, transcribed all the poems that they could find, and that's featured in a book called Island. I won't take the time to read the poem to you right now, and I realize we're going kind of quickly, but I also want to hear from my other co-presenters. This shadow of exclusion still stretches into the present day. And the reason that I say that is in part because we couldn't keep our actual family name in order to get through the detention center and be allowed to come into San Francisco Chinatown, my grandfather had to claim a relationship to somebody that he knew from the village, but who was not an actual blood relation. And so when you hear that term paper son, paper daughter, it's referring to these coaching papers. When I say coaching, I mean that it's a series of questions and answers, so that when you're being interrogated for hours and hours and days, because sometimes that is how long it took, that you could satisfy the immigration official who is, grilling you about, details that were so specific that even if you were a blood relation, under that, kind of tension of coming up with the right answer quickly, you might even make a mistake, even if you actually had that relationship. I think the other issue or shadow has to do with this idea that Chinese really didn't belong, that they would never belong. And so this whole idea of being forever foreign and not being able to fully assimilate has contributed to some of the tensions that we see today. This is a political cartoon. There were many. There's, you can find the magazines, national magazines of, Harper's, Puck, of the late 1900s, had many of these kinds of cartoons. I know it's a little hard for you to read, but it says the Chinese wall around the United States of America, throwing down the ladder by which they rose. And it's that idea, which interestingly is still very large in American imagination, because look at the effort put into continuing to build a wall at the southern border with Mexico by at least the previous administration. I won't go into these other immigration laws, but I hope that as you look at the years anyway, you can see how it's just, every, it's not really a cycle, but, every 10 years, 15 years, yet another country would be added. And 1924 was when it was the most completed, and pretty much, from Asia, immigrants would not be welcome. And it's not until 1965 that there is more of a reform that opens the doors. In addition to the exclusionary laws just about immigration, there were many other laws that harassed and limited what Asians and what Chinese specifically could do. And so these are just a couple of examples. On the right is an infamous pamphlet that was written by a labor leader named Samuel Gompers called Meat versus Rice. And what he's talking about is his assumption, this is in the 1880s, his assumption that the American standard of living is centered on meat, and those cheap workers, those Chinese, they mostly eat rice, and they're bringing down the entire standard of living. Now, given today's dietary concerns, this might be a little bit hard to grasp, but back in its time, it was rather persuasive. I'll just make one other comment. At the bottom level of the screen, you see there's like an actual law that's being voted upon, and this had to do with what were called alien land laws. That property ownership is it's a cornerstone of American society in terms of the American dream. And so laws were passed to prevent aliens ineligible for citizenship, which included, of course, the Chinese and all the other Asians, from ever owning land in their own, owning property in their own name. At the same time, I would be remiss if I didn't comment on those Asians who used the courts and the American laws to try to fight for the rights that they felt they were entitled to. And so these are just two photos of two people who really should be a lot more well-known, especially if you're studying civil rights law, Yip Wo and Wong Kim Ark. But sadly, you might not discover it until you go to law school. I hope that it will be taught a little more broadly in the time to come. I will just close by saying that, you know, this is just a little slice of history, but I hope that in thinking about the ways in which laws and structures might have been extremely unwelcoming and, you know, discriminatory and harassing and all of those things, that at the same time, people, they knew it was wrong and they fought back and they had some successes, which is why I had those court cases. You know, without Wong Kim Ark, the whole discussion about citizenship as in terms of its birthright would not be as solidified as it currently is. And so I hope that as we continue to think and about our history and discuss our history, that we will be in that spirit of silent no more. And I will pass the mic back to Lynn and Erica, and also stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you so much again, Tracy, for your presentation. Really appreciate it. It gives us a really good introductions about how the first group of Asian immigrants enter into this country. So the next presenter I'd like to introduce to all of you is Erica Chung. And Erica has been an advocate for racial and social justice for so many years, both professionally and personally. And she worked as the executive director of Washington Initiative for Diversity and the executive director of the Washington Supreme Court Minority and Justice Commission and the legislative and community liaison of the Washington State Asian Pacific American Affairs. She has been serving on numerous civic organizations board, including the API Coalition of Seattle, the Alliance for Immigrant and Refugee Justice, and the Korean American Coalition. And currently, Erica works as the commission specialist at the Port of Seattle. And she is continuing working on the board of the National Consortium of Racial and Ethnic Fairness in the courts to promote equal justice, and a member of the Seattle, Washington State Korean Association. So let me go ahead and give the time to Erica next. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lynn. And thank you, Tracy. That was a great historical background. When you were talking about history, I got so excited. I actually dug up a lot of history about Korea. So I think I might have overdone it here. But having said that, part of the reason I did do that is because it kind of, our history shaped who we are as people. And just going to the timeline, even though the Korean history is a long history, I'm really only going to cover the last century. And part of the reason is because there were such drastic changes that happened in over 1 century that completely changed the Korean people. So for example, it was a traditional monarchy for over 3,000 years. But the last monarchy was from 1852 to 1919. That was the last monarchy. And during that time, you know, it was an agrarian society, and we were focused on traditional values, and it had very distinct hierarchies in terms of classes, upper class, lower class, educated, non-educated. It was very distinct. And then between 1910 and 1945 was the official Japanese occupation. So you had a complete change, but the Japanese occupation actually started much sooner than that, as early as 1905, or some even say earlier. But from 1910 officially to 1945 was about 40 years, where during that time, Japan has systematically try to wipe out Korean history and culture and heritage. So it really made a huge difference. Schools and university were forbidden to speak Korean in school. They tried to eradicate Korean documents, and they forced Korean people. They took about 725,000 Korean people to Japan to work as laborers. And then it is estimated about 200,000 girls were taken to be used as sex slaves. And even that number is still in debate. Some say as low as 50,000, others say as high as 450,000. So you can see what's going on here. So, and there's no actual documentation, and these are all anecdotal comments from actual sex slaves, you know, military personnel, government officials. So you can see from an agrarian monarchy to the Japanese occupation, that has really shaped like this transition. And then between 1945 to 1950, Korea was liberated because of the end of World War II. They were not liberated some other way. So that ended so drastically for the Korean country. And because there was no system of government themselves, it was decided rather quickly that Korea would be under a trustership, international trustership, and it was decided by Soviet Union and the US. And so they divided the country at the 30th parallel, which is about equal zones, and it was decided that US would occupy the southern half and that the Soviet Union would occupy the northern half. And you can sort of, you know, you could see what had happened. Obviously, it didn't go well. And under the US troops, they were starting to, you know, develop a government, elect a president. And then in the north, Kim Il-sung, the first dictator, started to consolidate his power and was in control of North Korea. And since the country has always been one country, obviously there was a lot of tension between the two sides, and North Korea thought that he should consolidate it under his rulership, under one communist rule. So there was a lot of turmoil here. And let me just share an image to give you an idea of what had happened. So I don't know if you can see very well, but the whole country was affected by the war. So the brown line indicates the North offensive. So here's the brown line. And then here's the green line, which is the US offensive. And then the orange line is the communist offensive. So the whole country literally was affected, except for this tiny little area. And here is a picture post-war. I mean, literally left the country completely decimated with very little to show for after the war. If I remember correctly, I remember hearing that there was only few buildings of noteworthy were left after the war. So it was fairly decimated. And most importantly, the country ended up in a stalemate. There was no clear winner, so it ended up being a stalemate, and it's still divided by the 30th parallel. And Korea is still technically a war, and families are still technically separated by an arbitrary line. Then in 1950 to 53, the Korean War, and then 1953 to 1961, post-war South Korea. Like most post-war countries, South Korea was hindered by corruption and instability. And then South Korea was heavily dependent on US aid for food and materials for reconstruction. But the interesting thing is, this is when you start to have this cultural shift in the country. Because of all of the past history, the old social classes and social barriers are breaking down. And so you had, you know, some who are still relatively well off, but for the most part, everybody was poor, everybody was struggling. There was still some educated class, but for the most part, everybody was sort of in the same boat. And, with US occupation, you had education that was available to everybody. And unlike the past where only the ruling class were educated, education was available. So education was in high demand at the time. And because Korean families viewed education to economic success and social mobility based on past history, education became a top priority. And it still holds, that cultural value still holds to this day. So if you look at the Korean American community, they're highly educated. A lot of them have advanced degrees. And based on the research, based in 2016, South Korea had 98% had high school degree and approximately 70% received higher education. And this is also when Korea are struggling to survive. If you think about it, the Japanese occupation, the Korean War, and so they're still struggling to survive. And that mentality is still within the community. We've struggled. That has been the focus of the Korean population. And that has been the struggle when they immigrated to the United States. That mentality of survival has never gone away. And then, of course, after all of that, we still have the military coup because the country was not running well. And, General Park Chung-hee took over as president from 1963 to 1979. Before that, it was considered a dictatorship. And then I won't go into the history of the assassination and all of that, but the next one is Korean immigration can be identified with three distinct patterns. You have the 1903 to 1949 as the first wave. And during that time, you had migrant workers coming to the US through Hawaii, as well as going to other parts of the world because of the extreme famine and political climate. And also there was a few, and those migrant workers were used to replace Chinese laborers because they worked cheaper than the Chinese laborers. And then there was a few students who were sent to the US to study with the assistance of American Presbyterian and Methodist missionaries. And so again, this is also the time that Koreans were starting to adopt Christianity. And Christians were the one who also assisted with the protests against the Japanese occupation. So the Christianity really took hold during this time and really grew. And so if you look at history, Protestant and Catholicism are the two largest religion in Korea. And here in the US, you see many Christians because of that history from that point. And then the second wave really came from 1950 to 1965. Because of the Korean War, there was a lot of military GIs. And so this is when they started to bring in war brides, wives of American soldiers starting to enter the US, and also orphans adopted by American families. Because of the war, there was a lot of orphan kids as well as mixed race kids. And because Korea was such a homogenous country at that time, anybody who was different they were not very accepting of anybody who were very different. So for that reason, there was a lot of exporting of children. And Korea was one of the, in the US, Korean adoptees make up one of the largest population from the various countries. And again, there was also a limited number of student businessmen and intellectuals, but mainly many of the war brides settled in this country. And city of Tacoma is a clear example because there's a military base, there's a lot of mixed families there. And the Korean community is an example of that era. And then when in the third wave in 1965, when the immigration policy changed, that's when you really saw this huge influx of Korean immigrants because of the family unification policy. And our family also entered through this particular policy because my aunt had married an American GI She was the first one to come in the 1960s, and then she slowly petitioned for the rest of the family to enter. And as immigrants arrived in the US, they also brought their cultural values of that time. So for example, our family immigrated in 1965. So my parents' cultural values are still stuck in that time. The interesting thing is, when I do speak with various immigrants, is that when we immigrate, we cling to the values of that era. So my parents' values are still stuck in the 70s and the 80s. The country has moved on, but our cultural values, the way they teach their children, is from that particular era. So our values are so much more conservative than the values of the current native Koreans, which is also very interesting. So for that reason, we have very strong values of family. My parents hate communism, and even still they do, even though we've been in this country for many generations, that still really sticks to them. And a lot of the other first generations, older generation, they will tell you how much they still hate communism. Anything that smells of socialism, they're automatically thinking communism, even though it has nothing to do with it, because of that particular history. And also, it was very much a male-dominated society, so they valued boys over girls. And that at that era, my mom, even though we lived in this country for many decades, she still clings to those kinds of values, as well as that education is the only path to social and economic stability. It doesn't matter what you do, you still have to go to college. And you hear that comment over and over, and it's rooted from the past of their survival, that during the Japanese occupation and post after that, they realized education was not available to everybody. So their thinking is, if you're educated, then you have access to a higher middle class opportunities. And also, similar to other immigrant stories, my parents immigrated to the US because they wanted to give us a better life and education. My dad went to college, my mom did not. He studied, he became an accountant, but obviously when he immigrated to the US, he couldn't really practice his profession because of his language ability. He spoke English, but broken English. And my mother really struggled with English. Even though they took classes, it just never really stuck. And so they had to work menial jobs. And my mother was a stay-at-home mom in Korea, but here she had to learn to work, and she had really no skills except being a housewife, and she didn't even really know how to sew either. So she had to learn that skill and worked in a sewing factory for a long time. And then when my dad worked as a machinist and was laid off, it was really hard, and they really thought hard about what they were going to do, because he was older and he wasn't able to work in a job that he could sort of work for the rest of his life. And so they decided to start a business. And it was a huge leap of faith, because they have actually no experience in business. They have no knowledge of how a business operates, but they learned from their friends. Their friends were running businesses. They had very, limited English proficiency, yet they were able to run a business and support their family. So that's what they did to support our family. And they worked long hours, no vacation, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And as we grew up, we started to help run the store as well. But again, it's a typical American, immigrant stories. And part of the reason that a lot of the Korean Americans are running small business is precisely for that reason. Not because they were great business persons, but they see their friends and family running businesses, and they think they too can do that with their limited English ability, and by borrowing from their family and friends at a high interest rate, that they can do that. They don't rely on other people. They really rely just on the Korean community to pull themselves out, because not because they didn't want to, I think because they had very little English ability, they just didn't know what was available, and they just kind of clung to what they knew, and they did that. And so as our culture evolved, and you can see the Korean American community, that's how it's evolved. We were focused on survival, we're focused on business, we're focused on education. And these all stem from the impact of the last centuries of Korean history, which is kind of interesting to me anyway. And just as an example, I stuck a photo in there because you had it in there too, Tracy. So when my parents got married in their 60s, as you can see, they're all wearing traditional clothing because of the fact that you had the monarchy where they're all wearing traditional clothing. Japanese occupation, they still wore traditional clothing. Korean War, it's really only when the US troops really started coming in mass that they started to adopt more American customs and behaviors and clothing. I was trying to look for another photo where we immigrated, and you can see we're all attired in more Western clothing. So, but I couldn't find it. And as I indicated before, Korea has evolved from where it was before. I mean, it's a modern society with all new buildings, but culturally, they have evolved. But here in the United States, Korean Americans, our culture is still rooted in the time that we immigrated. And my culture is still rooted in that 70s, 80s period. So I hope that gave you some kind of an idea of our Korean American community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica, for sharing so personal story. So much of it is really resonating, I think, with a lot of people who are recent immigrants. So thank you so much. Let me go ahead and introduce you to our final speaker, and then we will go ahead and open up for some questions for those of you who are interested in getting a little bit more information, or just want to have a little bit discussions, because I know many of you are all leaders from your own organizations too. So thank you again for being here. So name, our final speaker is the Assistant Attorney General currently representing the Washington State Department of Retirement System. Prior to working at the Attorney General's office, he has worked in private sectors and in a lot of other places, actually in Texas, for example, where he graduated from the Boston University School of Law in 2010. And he went to Texas, and he has volunteered also in other states where he was moving around, helping address a lot of economic and social problems caused by the oil spill. And he has also helped with the youth development program, social service program for those who have limited English proficiency, and work training programs for workers displaced by the oil spill. And Nam has in the past volunteered as assistant, scoutmaster before, and now, of course, really enjoy working in the state of Washington. So let me go ahead and give the time to Nam.
Thank you, Lynn. And yes, one thing to mention is I am originally from Washington. We immigrated to Fort Burien, Washington in 1990. I was about 7 years old at the time. So I'll start by introducing myself and the organization that I am currently chairing, the Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs. Then I'll present some basic demographic about the API population in Washington State, and I'll share some of my personal history. I'll try to keep this under 10 minutes for questions. First, I am currently the Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs is actually like a state agency. It's like the Department of Retirement System, Department of Revenue. We have a director, Toshiko Hasegawa, And what we do is that we advocate and we advise the state legislature, the governor's office, and other public institution on Asian and Pacific American issues. Uh, Often that entails looking at proposed legislation and weighing in on them to see how they affect our community. And how we pick our commissioners that we pick all across the state from the API community. We look for people who work in the community and represent the community, so they can bring the perspective of the community to the commission, and the commission in turn bring that perspective to governmental entities. Now, I don't have a PowerPoint, but I do have some handout and actually links to handout. And this is the latest, and they're in the chat box. This is the latest data on the Asian Pacific American population in the state. We're closing in on 1 million total API in the state. The fastest growing population, ethnic population in the state. And our population has doubled in the last 20 years. That's not surprising, because when you see us, people think East Asian, especially here, with Tracy and Erica and Lynn and I, we're both from East Asian country. But when we talk about API, we're talking about 40 different nations. That includes the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, and the Pacific Islands. Those are vastly different culture and different political identity and vastly different immigration history to this country. In fact, Pacific Islander are natural born citizens. And that presents a problem with us, because statistics and the census and otherwise tend to group API people together. Now that had caused some effect on how social services are provided and how government treats the Asian American population. You have all probably heard of the model minority myth. That's the idea that somehow Asians are the good minority, that they somehow are more prosperous than others. But if you look at statistics, that's not always true. Yes, certain Asian communities generally tend to be on the higher economic strata. But you look at the data, there are also communities that don't have the same success as others. And there are various reasons for that. But grouping them to one makes a false impression. And even so, people can't really point to actually Asian American doing better than other ethnic group. The poverty rate for Asian American is about the same as the entire population of the country. So one thing CAPA does and always focus on is how to disaggregate the data. So we can have accurate data on specific group to tailor the service the government provide, so that they can address specific needs of Pacific community and not address Asian American as a uniform group, because we're clearly not. Because if we have actually a representative panel of Asian API here, we would have people from India, from the Philippines, from Iran, from Israel. Those are considered Asian country, even though ethnically some of those countries probably consider more Middle Eastern than Asian, but statistically, they're often tied together. Now, I'll move on to my own personal history. Erica, the Korean American and the Vietnamese American share one thing in common, and that is a lot of our immigration history stems from a war. The Korean War, for us, the Vietnamese War, the Vietnam War. And unlike Korean, I would say before 1975, before the fall of Saigon, there were very few Vietnamese here. I do have family members that were here before 1975, but they're mostly through cultural exchange program or military exchange program. I would say probably there are probably less than 1,000 Vietnamese in the U.S. before the fall of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. One of the most famous person that lived in the United States was actually Ho Chi Minh. He came here. He lived here in New York for a while, according to himself. It's not confirmed that he actually lived in the United States. But that makes us one thing unique about Vietnamese American is that we went from literally zero to literally hundreds of thousands within a very few short time. In 1975, about 100,000 Vietnamese American left Vietnam and moved to the United States because of the fall of Saigon, when communist North Vietnam took over Republic South Vietnam. Now, it's important to note that this is a civil war, much like the Korean War. I have family on both sides. In fact, my maternal grandmother had two brothers. Her youngest brother was a colonel in the South Vietnam Republic Army. Her older brother, was a colonel in the North Vietnamese Army. And for about 40 years, the two brothers never talked to each other. And they only recently talked to each other just before each individual death, about 10 years ago. They met after 40 years of separation. And it was rumor in the family that the North American the North Vietnamese colonel actually saved his brother's life during the Tet Offensive in Hue. But he could not confirm that because by the time they met, the North Vietnamese colonel was suffering from Alzheimer's, which no longer, his memory was not what it was. So my family did not, I had family that came from the first wave after the fall of Saigon. And I have also had family from the second wave, which is well known as the boat people, where Vietnamese Americans who were persecuted or were suffering under communist regime took to the sea to escape Vietnam. Many ended up in refugee camp in the Philippines, Thailand, and other countries. Many perished at sea. Fortunately, my family, we did not have any family member that perished at sea. But that was a common occurrence, especially because pirating was frequent back then to exploit the situation of many people fleeing a country at one time. So many people were never heard from again. Because of the boat people and the humanitarian crisis of the boat people, the United States and the Vietnamese government, the communist government, decided to work together to have a program called Orderly Departure. And that's the program that my family utilized to come to the United States. That allows South Vietnamese officers and soldiers and people who work with the South Vietnamese government to apply for asylum in Vietnam in order for them to basically immigrate to the United States and have refugee status. Now, the reason why my parents left specifically was not that because we were specifically fearing any physical violence or harm and persecution that way. My father, at the time he left the country, he was he was working for a bank. They left for us. They left for my sister and I, because even though my dad had a good job and opportunity to advance in Vietnamese society, he had a college education. He knew that his children could not get a college education because of his status as a former officer of the South Vietnamese government. There was persecution and discrimination against the children of South Vietnamese officer. So for that reason, my parents decided that we would pack up and move to the United States, and we were sponsored by my dad's older brother. That's why we went directly to Seattle, here in Washington. And from that point on, we lived in various places south of Seattle usually, and I was able to get an education. My oldest sister is a graphic designer. My second older sister is a doctor for UW Medicine, and I am an attorney for the state. So in a way, we did well. We would call what some people would call the American dream, but I would call it something else. And that's not something I want to get into now, but it reflects a history that is different and unique among Asian American immigrants because we're relatively new. 40 years of history is not a long history compared to Chinese American, even Korean American and Japanese American in this country. So we have somewhat a unique culture. A lot of it is political because the Vietnam War, the older generation tends to be more conservative. We're one of the few Asian American group, I believe Filipino, the other, that traditionally vote conservative. That's changing over time as the younger generation now tend to lean more toward the liberal side. And also, as I noted, we moved around the country, and a lot of it is based on what you did back in Vietnam. I worked in Battery, Alabama, helping out Vietnamese American that were shrimpers, fishermen. And they were their family were fishermen back in Vietnam. So they moved there and they fish and shrimp in Battery. Um, and a lot of people who were more inclined toward government, a lot of more professional, the general moved to DC. So I lived in those various communities, and the politics and the culture of that is somewhat different. As you imagine, you live in Seattle, liberal Seattle, the community here tends to be more liberal. Houston tends to be more conservative. But in general, we do share a common culture. We still have to keep tradition, food, temple, and church. Those things remain uniform throughout our community. So right now, currently, we're facing a lot of rancor within our community about the politics of the last election. But in a sense, I'm hopeful because in a way, even though we disagree on politics, we still share common bonds. So we have this history of traveling, of losing our country, and then traveling across the ocean, building a community and a life here, and contributing to it. To a point where we have a state rep and a state senator that's Vietnamese American. We are represented in the US Congress. And our footprint is starting to be stamped on American culture, American life. Thank you.